Welcome to Literally Books, the podcast. I'm
My
Lindsay.
name is Magda.
And this week we're going to be talking about the book Mickey7 with its author, Edward Ashton. Woo!
Woo! So excited to have this
I'm so excited.
conversation. Sorry,
Me
Lindsay, I didn't
too.
match you with the. I'm like, yay!
I know we didn't put it out at the same time. We got it. We know
We
the
got
cover.
it.
It's a cool cover.
It's really beautiful.
You recommended this book. I am so grateful that you did because I read it in like a night and a half because I was so into it.
Yeah, the story is really good. It's a quick read. Like, it goes by super great. And it leaves some long lasting effects about things, maybe like a mild existential crisis type of thing. But we'll get
Yeah,
into it.
very much in your feels after you read it. But let's start with, what are you reading?
All right, so I'm still in my Sarah Adams era. I just finished reading her book Practice Makes Perfect, which is the second book after the one that I read last week. And this book, it was just even better than the first one. I was so surprised. I didn't think that I was gonna be able to like tap it, and this one, it is just incredible. It's still with the small town type of girl. And remember how we were talking that like I wanted the story where the guy would move into the small town, and he did, and he quit his like grown-up job, and then he stayed there with her. And I'm like, okay, Sarah, I think Sarah Adams like heard me from the
You
future or something.
manifested. You manifested.
So
Yeah.
it was great. I really love that book. Then the second one that I'm about to finish reading that I think we're both doing is Legendborn by Tracy Deonn. We're going to be doing an episode on this in the future, so I am almost done with it, and then we'll be starting Bloodmarked pretty soon.
Yeah, I've actually already started Bloodmarked because I'm ahead of my homework.
I
No, I'm
know
just
she
kidding.
is. You are. Like, I am a
No,
procrastinator.
you're not at all. You read you so much faster than me, and that's why I had to be ahead because I would never finish. But OathBound is coming out in like a week and a half from when we're recording this. So I have not taken to a series so quickly in a long time as I have to this series. Moving beyond Legendborn. Sorry, did you get to say all the books that you were reading?
Yeah, those two.
Okay, so I read a book this week that it's like a pretty rare moment where I'm like, I'm obsessed with this. I can't put it down. I don't know what to do with myself. I read this book called The Memory Police. Have you heard of that?
Mm-mm.
Okay, so the book is by Yoko Ogawa. It's a Japanese book that was translated to English. I picked this up like randomly. We went out to go to Flutter, the new romance bookstore here in Austin, and I came back and I was like, I don't really know. I'm not really feeling like I want to read the Legendborn series, so I just picked up a book, and this one was sitting on my TBR, and I was like, I'm just going to try it. I'm in a mood where I'm going to try like the first 15 pages of a bunch of different books, and when I tell you, this book hit me in a way that I was not expecting. I could not put it down. It's essentially a speculative fiction book where these people live on an island and objects disappear, and they disappear from people's memories when they disappear. So one day they'll wake up and the concept of a novel will disappear. And so they'll burn all the books, and people don't even have emotions about it because the idea of a novel also disappears with the physical like manifestation of that thing.
Oh, that is creepy. I love
Uh-huh.
it.
And it just progresses. So you follow one character as she's sort of navigating the situation with the people around her. And it just, maybe it's because of like the time in the world right now or whatever, but about the importance of stories and keeping memories alive. I don't know. I was so taken with it. It was great.
I love the premise. I think I'm adding this one to my TBR. That sounds fantastic.
It's a quick read. It's really well written speculative fiction. It was a really good translation, at least I think so. I don't know. I didn't read the original Japanese, but I felt like it just like really hit me. Although you're not gonna, it's depressing. So I'm warning you right now. I'm warning you.
Okay, this might have to be like an April one because I feel like we're reading some other things that I need like my romance happy place as palette
Hmm.
cleanser. So it might just have to be added into the stack for later.
Okay. Yeah, but that's it.
All right. Do you want to take a little break and then we'll kind of cover some book news?
Let's do it.
All right, we'll be right back.
Welcome back. We are going to start our book news segment before we get into Mickey7 with Edward Ashton. The first story this week comes from actress Julianne Moore. She indicated on her social media and in various news outlets that her book, Freckleface Strawberry, which is a children's book basically about someone who is a young redhead with freckles that's trying to accept her differences, was potentially banned in various libraries and school systems. In February 10th, she got a memo from the Department of Defense announcing that several books and learning materials had been removed from class curriculums and flagged for review. And this was one of them. super frustrating tale. I truly don't know why this book is banned. It seems so inoffensive.
Yeah, I don't know what the danger this poses to children. Probably just loving and accepting yourself. That's too much. So yeah, not
Yeah.
great. We're not going in a great direction for with our book bans.
No. Okay, next story.
On some lighter news, Christopher Nolan just released the very first picture of Matt Damon, who is going to be playing Odysseus in the movie The Odyssey, which is like a really like the budget and the cast for this movie are insane. Anybody who's anybody in Hollywood is going to be in this movie. The shooting is going to start in Messina, Greece on March 10th, and it's expected to continue until March 25th. Really excited for it, honestly. I haven't read the Odyssey and the Iliad in a long time, but kind of looking forward to this movie.
And now we have to do a shout out to one of our local bookstores because I feel like they are doing the best work right now and a really hard time to be a bookstore owner. So we're going to have a shout out to Black Pearl Books, owned by Eric and Katrina Brooks. They have basically a nonprofit that's an extension of their bookstore that gives access to banned books to the Texas school districts. So they allow donations and then they distribute those books. They've been recognizing that book bans often drive up sales, and the store actively supports access through its nonprofit called Put It in a Book. The organization promotes diversity, inclusion, and representation by bringing authors to Title I schools and donating to women's prisons and partnering with groups to read to third graders. Super awesome initiative.
And if you're in the Austin area, go check them out, go support them. They are incredible. They put on so much work with the community, not just with this, but like they have a really great communal space where they host a lot of things just to kind of benefit the community, and they're just incredible. So go support either you're in Austin or just go look for your independent bookstore that is near you. All right, and then last but not least, probably not Lindsay's favorite books here, but Twilight is celebrating its 20th year anniversary with some special book editions. They're releasing 3 brand new special editions. The first one is a deluxe collector's edition that is like this beautiful hardcover of the first book, Twilight. Has this beautiful like ribbon bookmarked, and it is just gorgeous. The second one is a Twilight 20th anniversary edition, which is a paperback, and it has a beautiful sprayed edges. And then the third one is the Twilight Saga Deluxe hardcover collection that includes all 4 books, and they are absolutely gorgeous. Like they have these beautiful flowers embossed and colored on them, and they're just really beautiful. So if you're a really big fan of the Twilight books, I think these books are really beautiful and they're gonna look really great in your library.
It's nice to see a special edition that actually feels special. I think this has come up a lot on Book Talk, but I sort of agree with it that especially if the ACOTAR special editions came out that were just black with gold embossing, they feel like a cash grab where you're just like, there's nothing. It's just another version of the book.
Yeah.
But these actually are very cool looking. You're exactly right. I think I don't like the books, but I would buy them for a trophy because they look cool.
They look so beautiful. Like
I know.
they're not boring. Like a lot of the special editions that try to go with this minimalistic, I don't want to say beige vibe. I like, the beige vibe as I'm wearing beige. But you know what I mean? Like it's
Yeah.
just really boring. And these ones are just absolutely gorgeous. Like I would love to have them. They're really cute.
And I'm going to be in Forks in a few months.
So see,
I'll
maybe
send all the pictures.
Ooh, I can't wait. You need to go do the Twilight tour. There's actually one. All right, we'll be right back with Mickey7 with Edward Ashton.
Welcome back. We are going to get into a quick discussion with some spoilers of Edward Ashton's Mickey 7. So skip this episode, go watch the movie, read the book, which is the best, and then come back to it. But we're just going to get into it. Magda, get us started with a quick synopsis.
All right. After some unfortunate gambling decision, Mickey Barnes decides to flee a dangerous gangster on his home planet of Midgard and enlists as an expendable on a colonization mission to the ice world of Niflheim. In his role, Mickey must take on dangerous jobs to preserve the other colonists' safety. Each time Mickey is killed in the line of duty, a genetic copy that includes his most recently uploaded memories is brought to life.
I mean, the concept is so strong. It's so straightforward.
It's so good.
It's so interesting. I always struggle too with the high concept plot because I'm always like, I don't know, like, is something else going to happen beyond this idea of this crazy thing that we've never encountered before? And this book does such a good job of saying, yes, other things are going to go on. You're going to get into the dynamics and the existentialism of this idea, and it is so freaking good.
It is really good. And we get really philosophical. And although the book does not go into details about, like, and here's the philosophical question, it just
No.
plants ideas throughout the thing that you just start thinking about it. And you're just like, oh, wait, like, this is kind of crazy. And we're going to be talking about some of these themes as we start discussing it. But that's what I think the storytelling in this book was so strong, because it's not implicitly telling the reader how to feel. It's just slowly planting those breadcrumbs along the way. And I love that.
It's also really, it's told in a really funny way. So like the things that are much dark, it's kind of my favorite tone. It's my favorite thing about science fiction too, where you're being presented information that's new that you've never encountered before. He does it in a way that's really funny. There's a lot of humor, a lot of like snark. But then at the edge of that snark is this like very intense dread and darkness. And you're like, uh-oh. He never brings it to the forefront, but you can feel it kind of encroaching in sometimes. And you're like, no, what's going to happen? It's so good.
I loved it. Yeah, the dark comedy that is used in this book, it is done really well. I loved it so much. But maybe let's go ahead and get started. And I think a good introduction to this is just for us to discuss the very first scene, just because it's going to lead us into like a really good conversation. Do you want to kind of walk us through that?
Yeah, so the first scene, we're already on Niflheim, and Mickey and his best friend from both his home planet, but also on this new planet, and I use friend in strong quotes, we'll talk about that later, Berto Gomez, is essentially piloting him through this mission where they want to explore the local wildlife, essentially, with these things called creepers that are these like giant scary monster things. And so Mickey is trying to crawl down this hole and get a sense of where they live, and he gets stuck. And he knows, like, I'm probably not going to be able to make it out. And Berto basically just says, sorry, my guy, deuces, I'm leaving you. I hope your death goes quickly. And that's the first scene.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And like I think Berto was just like, you know what to do. Just, pretty much kill yourself and then you're gonna come back anyway. So like why are you so worried about it? And it is we start seeing this detachment of what it means to die, because then they truly start seeing this iteration of him as an expendable. Like that is truly how it seems like, well, you're just gonna come back. So like why are you so worried about it? Even though he's still experiencing all of those traumatic feelings of dying, the pain, the memories, having that dread of having to go through it. And the people around him are just like, whatever. You're just gonna come back. No biggie.
Berto is. I don't think all the people around him are like that, but Berto definitely is like, nah, it's too much work for he like the thing that comes out of that scene that they talk about a lot is Mickey is saying he could have come and got me. Because and you know this because Nasha, who is Mickey's kind of love interest in the book, is speaking to him over a radio, and she's like, I'll come get you. I'll come get you. Like her immediate reaction is to save him. And Mickey's like, it's dangerous and I don't want her to get hurt. So I don't want her to come. But like, okay, so Berto definitely could have done something and he just doesn't. And
Mm-hmm.
you're exactly right that it's like a perfect first start to the conversation of like, what is happening here mentally that your friend is like, I'm gonna go. I'm sorry. I'm not gonna take the risk.
Yeah, exactly right. And I think this kind of leads us to, like there's a really big dynamic, not just here in the space, but also like amongst other colonies and everything. And it introduces us to this new religion called the Natalists, which is this religion where they really believe that the expendables don't have any soul and it's an abomination to human race. And they're like fully against this whole process. So then we're slowly kind of are introduced to this different sects of people kind of thinking about how they think about this. So you think about the people like Berto that are just like, whatever, you're gonna come back. And then you have the other people that are just like, are disgusted by the mere presence of Mickey just because like they just consider him a monstrosity. And he goes against human nature pretty much.
Yeah, and the person who is the height of that movement is this guy called Hieronymus Marshall. He is like the general, the leader of the colonist base, and he's sort of setting the tone for the other colonists about how they should interact with Mickey. And he is a natalist, so he freaking hates the existence of Mickey. He doesn't acknowledge him. He basically deals with him as a necessity of the mission, but it really sort of introduces the isolation that Mickey feels from the other people because of these sort of lingering feelings about whether or not Expendables have a soul.
Yeah, exactly. And And if they think they're gonna get weirded out by like the Expendables having a soul, what happens here in this book is that Mickey survives that fall that you just mentioned, and he's able to navigate himself through some tunnels back to camp. But Berto had reported that he had already died. So when he goes back into camp, we find out that there's now 2 copies of Mickey 7. So we have Mickey 7 and Mickey 8 now in the same place, which is, can you imagine the kind of like clutch your pearls and nails would think about this?
That's a perfect explanation.
So yeah, so that's kind of where like, and that's the whole theme of the book, pretty much trying to deal with Mickey, trying to deal with like, okay, I have a Mickey 7 and a Mickey 8, trying to decide who should leave, who should stay, all these type of things. Ultimately, like neither one of them is able to off themselves, I want to say. So they're
Or
just
kill the other,
yeah.
right? Because they have that like duel where they're trying to, they rock, paper, scissors to see which one of them
Yes.
is going to live. Mickey 7 loses. And you think like, oh, is Mickey 8 going to kill him? And ultimately he's not a psycho, right? These
Mhm.
aren't like, and this is interesting because I feel like it introduces this idea of like, yeah, people get used to the idea of Mickey being dying and being reincarnated, but some people deal with it a lot more easily than others. And Mickey 8 is like, no, I can't fucking kill this guy. I'm not crazy.
Yeah. And it's just like, then you start kind of, both of them kind of start living their lives. And then you kind of have like a little bit of a split on who they are as people and personality. And then we kind of start discussing of like what it means to be you, like what makes you you. That was a very Severance thing. If you guys watch Severance, you'll understand that reference. But yeah, it is just really funny that you kind of start thinking of like, okay, we have Mickey 7, Mickey 8. Now they start taking different decisions. Who is the original? But now you're on the 7th version already. So you're already kind of getting this departure of like who Mickey was in his first version. And it's just, we kind of start having those questions of who the real one is. And it's just kind of, I find it really fascinating to kind of have those discussions. I don't know.
Yeah, it's interesting because, like, you do, at least for me, because Mickey 7 is whose perspective we're following, I feel
Mm-hmm.
like he's the real one.
Yeah.
But you're right. It does introduce these weird dynamics of saying, like, they're not the same. I think that is the other thing is like, they're clearly not the same
Yeah.
because their reactions to things are similar, but their perspectives are slightly different, even from like the little amount of time where there's a gap between the consciousnesses. Because we know, like, you upload your consciousness. We know that Mickey 7 had been 6 weeks since he uploaded his consciousness. So, like, Mickey 8 is operating at a bit of a deficit. But, like, even that short amount of time, they are fundamentally, different in the way that they talk to each other in the books.
And I think that kind of leads us to like a really good point on the relationship dynamics. So we know we are met with Nasha, who is Mickey 7's girlfriend, but it kind of becomes weird because Mickey 8 was kind of hanging out in the room quite a bit as he was recovering from being born again. And Nasha becomes really close with Mickey 8, and Mickey 7 has to stay away, but he knows that Mickey 8 and Nasha are, hanging out. It's like, okay, is this okay? Is this cheating? Are you supposed to be okay with that? It just creates a really weird relationship dynamic that it's, how do you handle this when there's 2 of you and the other person think there's only 1 of you and you just have to be okay with this weird throuple relationship in a way?
And here is where I was like, I'm on board with this book. I think you know what I'm going to go talk about, which is it turns into a literal throuple. Like, at some point, Nasha finds out that Mickey 7 and Mickey 8 exist in the same timeline, and she loves them both. Nasha is our, like, for me, she's our moral center of the book. She's the most connected to Mickey. She's the most empathic. She's just the best. And like, obviously they're still having a relationship, and they all three have a relationship together. It's relations together. Yeah, it's
Yeah,
very
there
interesting.
was that was something that I did not see coming, but like there's this point where like Mickey 7 just walks in and Mickey 8 is there, Nasha's there, Nasha's like, yeah, come on over, and then they just get it on. And it was so unexpected because Mickey 7 is like, okay, sure, why not? Let's just see what happens. And it is the most hilarious, weird thing for the reader that you're just like, huh, this is kind of interesting. I don't know how I would feel about having sex with another copy of myself. I don't know. It's just really weird, but
It's a way
fascinating.
to it's fascinating
Uh,
because the central question that keeps coming up in the book is like, are Mickey 7 and Mickey 8 the same person? And if they're the same person, you should be fine with that. It's just
mhm.
like it's not a throuple. It's literally just like extra hands, you know? But I think that scene sort of forces the question of like, if you have a problem with this, or if even if you don't have a problem with it, if you're like, oh, what's happening here? Or you're like you're feeling a type of way about it. It's like because you think they're not the same to some extent.
Yeah, exactly. And we can kind of see like you feel like as soon as they're born, like they just start deviating from each other, and like yeah, to your point, like they start thinking about things very differently. Like Mickey 8 starts taking advantage of Mickey 7 for a while, where he just keeps sending him in all these dangerous missions because he's like, oh, I'm too weak. I'm sorry. I'm just gonna like stay behind. So you kind of start feeling bad for Mickey 7, and you start building this compassion for him because he's the one that's doing all the hard work, and Mickey 8 is just living his best life in his bedroom with Nasha. Oh gosh. Anyways, maybe we should talk a little bit about what were some of the things that kind of shocked us the most. No, we kind of talked about the threesome, which I don't think it was shocking. It was just like a funny scene to me.
No, they don't go into depth either. For people
No,
that are more not into want closed door romance, if you want
yeah,
to there's nothing explicit that happens other than
that it happened. Yeah, but one of the things, in order to become an expendable, you have to go through this like really rigorous training, mental health tests, make sure that you're okay. And the final test for this is that they actually make you try to kill yourself. Like they give you this gun, and you have to be willing to be able to pull the trigger, and that's gonna be your first test in order to become, or the final test in order to become an expendable. And we kind of are able to be in his head about it. Like it's a really difficult position to be in, where like in concept it's like, oh yeah, I'm gonna be able to do it, but once it comes time for you to be able to make that decision that you're going to have to sacrifice yourself, it's a very different feeling when it's real life. And we kind of see Mickey's struggle, and he ultimately does do it. Like he does pull the trigger. Obviously it was blank, there was nothing in it, but that was the test, that he had to be willing to sacrifice himself in order to save, the crew members or whatever, because that's the whole purpose of this. The person that is going to be taking on this role has to be selfless, has to be able to make those sacrifices, and they have to be okay with that. And it is a really hard to deal with, no matter how many mental evaluations you have to go through. That has to take a really big toll on your brain and your psyche.
I completely agree. And Gemma, who is sort of Mickey's teacher during this exercise, so they're also like in space, right? So they're trying to teach him the functional, because he's not a trained astronaut. He's not a trained scientist. He's here because he's trying to flee this gambling debt that he incurred on Midgard. That's his like most obvious motivation. But she basically says like, pull the trigger. You can't do this role because you're gonna have to make this hard decision. She also introduces the idea of the ship of Theseus. She like introduces the story to him, and the ship of Theseus is the idea that if you are floating on a ship in the ocean and you have to do repairs to that ship, and slowly over time you've ended up replacing every plank on the ship, at the end of your journey, is it the same ship? And I think that is the central thesis of the whole book. It's the central thesis of this moment where Mickey's going to have to decide, like, am I a new ship, yes or no? And regardless of the answer, am I okay to move forward? And ultimately he does.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it is this has to be probably like studied for philosophy majors or grad students or whatever, because it is true. Like, I think the moment that you start taking pieces away, you still have some originals to you, but then the moment that you're just fully replaced, is that really you? Even though it's the same pieces, you just slowly start doing it. I don't know. It is. You're absolutely right. That is the main fundamental question of the book, and I don't think that's a right answer to this. It's just however you feel and you're perceiving this.
Should we move into the existentialism of it all? Because that's kind of what we're circling.
Yeah, I think we should do it. I know you had some really good thoughts about immortality, and the way that they sell this to them, it's through immortality.
Yeah, I well, I've said it already, basically. Like, I don't think he's immortal. I think that's the question of the book, is like, is he immortal? That's the question of the ship of Theseus. And yeah, I don't think he's immortal, because I think even these slight moments, even the fact that, like, one of the things that they say is like, you have to remember your death. So a lot of times they'll make him upload right after he's died so that they can learn information about like how his death might impact a person who couldn't recover. And I think even by way of experiencing that, and then being re-uploaded with that information, you're not going to be the same as the person that you were before you had that experience and then came through it. So I don't know. For me, the ship of Theseus is a new ship.
Yeah, same. That's kind of how I see it too. So that I think we're aligned on that as well. The other thing too that we kind of get into this, it's the colonization process of this.
Yeah.
We in this book we talk really heavily that the human race is going into other planets to try to find like a new place to live because Earth died pretty much 600 years ago due to some catastrophe, as you might expect. So they're just trying to go into other planets and find the next best thing, and they're continuing to do this over and over again. And it is a really similar experience to what happened when somebody is expanding, where they're trying to assert dominance over the natives that are there, whether they are little creatures or they're sentient creatures, etc. And in this case, in Niflheim, we have these creepers that Lindsay mentioned, and they seem to kind of treat them like bugs. But then once you start kind of introducing that, hey, these might be sentient beings, maybe we should kind of start considering it. But some people still see them as less than you, and it just starts bringing like a different concept of how do we feel about colonizing these people that actually have their own thoughts versus not, and what is the difference between the two if we find them sentient versus not, even though if this was their original home. That was a really hard debate that we were going through in this book, and I love that because he doesn't tell you this, he just leaves the breadcrumbs for you the reader to figure it out.
And then he shows you an example because Mickey is a historian by trade. I don't know, not even
Yeah.
by trade, by interest, by hobby. And so he's walking through like some of the other colonization efforts. And the one that I think is most interesting is the Alan Manikova takeover of a country called Galt. And so Alan Manikova is like a Schmilon Schmusk kind of billionaire. He's a genius though. And he basically is the person who creates the bioprinter that allows for expendables to exist. He uses that to monetize a bunch of different endeavors and then sells off all of his companies and moves to this place called Galt. And Magda, we didn't talk about this, but do you want to talk a little bit about the slush, the goo that's required to make an expendable? Because that's important for this conversation.
Yeah, so in order to be able to make copies of yourself, there is this like cylinder machine where you have to input a whole bunch of protein, calcium, and things like that. And that's what's going to kind of help generate extra copies of people. It's a pretty disgusting process. And actually, anytime that Mickey7 or somebody dies, they just throw them into this machine that is going to be able to allow to make other things. Not only this, you can also use this as food. So if, for instance, they don't have enough resources, this has protein, it has vitamins, it has all of the things that you need in order to sustain life. So not only are they making beings with this, you're also potentially consuming this as a source of energy, which is kind of gross.
So you can see, like, if things get weird really quickly because Edward Ashton is interested in the science of it. And he's like, energy and matter don't come from nothing. They have to come from somewhere. So this Alan Manikova guy basically leaves Midgard or Earth. I can't remember where exactly he's coming from. He moves to this country called Galt, where people have said, like, even though that we can issue these credits and because of all those technological advances, everyone can live a relatively stable life. They're like, I don't want to give you access to these trademarks. Like, I want to live using the resources that I created for myself. And so he's like, perfect. I'm going to go to that planet. I'm going to leave where I am. Or I'm going to leave Eden because these people are all trying to live an idyllic life. And I'm going to go here. And he ingratiates himself with the wealthy people that live there. And then slowly but surely, the wealthy people start disappearing.
Mm-hmm.
And what we find out is that he's killing them and using their proteins to make copies of himself. And he does this over and over again. And because these people are so concerned about their own pursuits, they're not paying attention to it until it hits their own door. And then at the end of the day, he ends up as a dictatorship of himself on this planet. And so they ultimately have to come up with an effort to destroy the planet because he's become so powerful, and they're worried about this colonization effort spreading to its absolute extreme max. And I think I'm obsessed with that story because it's just such an interesting conversation about economics, about power, about
Narcissism.
colonization. Like, it is just so interesting to me.
Yeah, it was kind of, and it just kind of talks about how the people in the planet just took too long to react, even though they started seeing little by little that this would happen. They're like, oh, it's not really impacting me. And they're like, when it was time for them to fight it, it was too late. And it just worked in so many levels. And I love this story. It was so great. The other one that I really enjoyed, and again, because Mick is a historian, he also gives us a thing of the one time that the humans and then the natives got along. It was in this planet called a long shot. And the only reason why they got along is because when the humans landed, they didn't know there was anybody there, and they only learned that there were natives like 20 years later. And then they're like, oh, I guess we can just coexist because we are all good now. And then that worked out. So it was just like, it wasn't because they wanted to get along. It's just like they didn't know they were in the same planet and they were sharing it. And they're just like, okay, yeah, I guess this works for us. We're good. Like, that's it. It just talks a lot about the human nature. And I love that because it was like the only reason why they got along is because they didn't know that they were there. And it just says a lot about who we are.
Do you remember when I was being like super annoyingly philosophical in a previous episode about orbital? And I was like, oh, people are best able to like speak about humanity when they're not in humanity, when they're like disconnected from it. This
Yes.
is another example of that, where it's like they're not around a lot of people. They're around like 200 people, but you get such a better sense of like the interpersonal dynamics because it's on such a microcosm. It's really good.
Exactly. I don't know. I think this book is just amazing. It's going to make you think a lot about who we are as people, what it means for us to be on top of the food chain, colonialism, just a little bit of everything. And the story is just told on a very dark comedic tone that it just makes the writing so enjoyable, and it's going to be great. I cannot wait for the movie, and I think we're going to be able to chat to Edward Ashton a little bit more about this, and I can't wait to have that conversation with him.
So let's take a little break, come back with Edward Ashton, and get into it.
We'll be right back.
All right. Today we are joined by Edward Ashton, author of Mickey7 and various other novels, including Mal Goes to War, Antimatter Blues, and like I said, Mickey7, which is now a major motion picture directed by Bong Joon-ho. He lives in upstate New York in a cabin in the woods, not that cabin in the woods, with his wife, a 9-pound killing machine named Maggie. In his free time, he enjoys cancer research, teaching quantum physics to Solon graduate students, and whittling. Welcome, Edward. We are so grateful to have you.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate the opportunity.
Yeah, and I think we like to start our interviews with like a really easy questions that we ask everybody when they come to the podcast is, what's the book that made you a reader, or what was your last 5-star read?
I mean, those are two totally different questions. The book that really pulled me into science fiction, which is where I do most of my writing, is a book called Shakespeare's Planet. It was written by Clifford D. Simak, I'm thinking about 1968 or 1969. So I read this when I was very young. I've reread it probably, 10 or 12 times over the years. I gave copies to all of my children and made them read it too. It's a short book, like a lot of Simak's works are, that touches on, it's fun and there's a lot of action and it's interesting, but also touches on some really deep philosophical questions about personhood and about who deserves the dignity of being considered a person versus a thing or an animal. And that's obviously something that I touch on a lot in my work as well. So that's one that I always go back to. My most recent 5-star read, though, was a book by an author named Riley August. It's called The Last Gifts of the Universe, which is a very recent release, which I very highly recommend. It's also got a tone that maybe is a little similar to some of my work. It's light, it's funny, it's got a lot of snark in it, but it also left me sort of weeping uncontrollably while I was walking my dog in the park and listening to it in audiobooks, which is slightly embarrassing, but still that tells you the author, touched a nerve. So I highly recommend
embarrassing. It's not embarrassing for us because we often talk about that. And I think that's when a book moves you, that's what makes you a reader.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's a rare and lovely experience when that happens. Okay, well, thank you so much. We always ask what the formative reads are because we find, particularly with our authors, but also with all of our guests, it really sets the tone for what they read in adulthood, whether they realize it or not. That canon from childhood to adulthood really sticks. And so I think your answer makes perfect sense because, like you said, we see that in the work really clearly. So thank you. Let's move on to a bit about Mickey7. Magda and I just came off of a deep dive, so we're deep into the themes of it at this point mentally. And we were curious. In the book, Mickey has as one obvious motivation for leaving his planet of Midgard, and then maybe some less obvious motivations. I know for us, we both agreed not a chance would we ever become a colonist. I assume you share that. What do you think motivates these other people to become colonists and leave this relative life of ease that they have on their home planets?
So, as an author, that was a real challenge for me because, unlike some science fiction presents space flight as like a really glamorous thing and something everybody loves and everybody's having a great time. I don't think that that's how it would be, and that's not how I portray it in my work. It's absolutely miserable. It's incredibly dangerous. As I lay out in the book, most of the people who do this die, and they die in really bad ways. So why would you do this? And so I build up this backstory of where we are as a species at that time, and the drive to expand is basically a secular religion among that culture. Um, in my timeline, we came very close to extinction on Earth right before the diaspora, and the drive to not let that happen again, to spread to as many places as possible, to make us as extinction proof as possible is sort of a driving force and sort of the highest calling that you can have in this society.
Yeah, and honestly, like I think this was something that you made it sound like so unappealing, which is, I think, I mean, that was the intent. It sounds like to do this special travel. And one of the things that, like, I thought it was so smart that you incorporated this was this slushy machine, which is how a lot of the times they get like their protein intake. And it was so realistic and so like matter of fact. And I just really appreciated that because, yeah, like, I'm like, yeah, I'm never going to want to do that type of job. Like, that sounds horrendous. And I'm not even going to be able to just be very real about that I am consuming things that even though we do it right now, you're kind of separated from the concept of what you're eating. And that just made it a lot more real. I just really love that concept.
So here's a question for you: have you ever read much? Are you familiar with the concept of hardtack?
No.
So hardtack is what European, in particular English explorers on sailing ships. It was the basis of their diet in the 14, 15, 1600s. These voyages would last sometimes for years. And hardtack was a sort of a biscuit. It was basically just flour and water baked into a biscuit and then dried to the point where it was almost, tooth breaking. And the standard way to eat hardtack would be to you take it out of the barrel where it's stored, and then you always be sure to tap it several times on the deck to knock the insects out before you eat it. And I wanted to sort of come up with a modern equivalent, sort of futuristic equivalent to hardtack. And the idea that it's not realistic that people would do this. I mean, we did this. That's what that's what people have been doing for thousands of years. The Polynesians who spread across the South Pacific, sailing off into the unknown, having no idea if there was any land even to be found out there, with nothing but what they could fit into their canoes. This is what we've been doing as a species, basically as long as we've been a species. So I don't feel it's unrealistic that people would do this.
No, it doesn't. And conversely, it's the unrealism of your depictions of space travel that are so compelling because it's baffling in some ways that anyone would ever sign up for it, but it's also, to your point, it really speaks to this search for, in some ways, maybe the greater good, or this greater need to preserve humanity that is so intrinsic to people that maybe they don't have to confront in modern life very often. So yeah, it definitely comes across that way.
Mm-hmm.
Just moving along kind of on that same note, I thought it was interesting when I saw in your bio that you enjoy cancer research, and you're a cancer researcher by trade today. Is that correct?
Correct. Yes.
I was curious because one of my favorite scenes in the book is the description of Alan Manikova and his takeover of Galt. And I was curious if your research into cancer cells equated at all to the fleshing out of his character and this need to like endlessly replicate for reasons that we don't fully understand in the book other than power.
When you spend as much time delving into a topic and fighting an enemy as I have. I've been doing this for 25 years now. You know, much of my life has been dedicated to the fight against cancer. You get to know your enemy well, and I have gotten to know cancer cells and malignancy very well over the last 25 years. And you hit it right on the nose. Alan Manikova is a cancer cell in sort of the body of humanity. And he spreads in exactly the way that a malignancy spreads, and he destroys the body around him in exactly the way that a malignancy does. You're actually the first person who's sort of picked up on that, but that is exactly what I was putting down. So thank you for recognizing.
It lands very well, and it felt very real. Was Alan himself based on someone in modern life?
Not any one particular person. I think there is. He's obviously a narcissistic sociopath, and I think unfortunately that's an increasingly prevalent personality type that we see in the world today. People who think that their needs supersede those of everyone and everything around them, and that every sort of fulfilling of their whims and wishes takes precedence. You know, if that causes the death of 1,000 people, that's great, but I got to have my latte 5 minutes sooner. I think that's unfortunately a very prevalent attitude today. And obviously with him, I took it to a very far extreme, but you know, as an author, that's what we do. We take trends that we see and we follow them to their logical conclusion. And to me, that sort of trend towards glorification of the self, Alan Manikova is the ultimate expression of that.
Changing a little bit on the topics, you also touch really heavily on the topic of individuality versus identity. It's like a really key concept in this book. I actually had a little bit of a mild existential crisis after I read this book, just thinking about this over and over again. I'm guessing this was the feeling that you wanted to spark in the readers after they did that. And where did the original, where did the concept come from?
So I think what you're talking about, what you're touching on, I think, is the idea of Mickey trying to understand if he is the same person as he travels in. So that's a philosophical question called the teletransport paradox. That's been around since at least 1755. That's the first reference I could find to it in a query to the English Philosophical Society. Where the query at that time was if one could transpose one's soul, because that was the way these, they weren't thinking of like brain cells and anything at that time. One could transpose one's soul into an exact duplicate of one's body. Would this, in your opinion, good sirs, be the same? Be me? Would this be the same person? Would it be a different person? And people have been chewing over that for ever since without any satisfactory conclusion. The way that I've formulated it to myself is to ask, and I think I touch on this in the book. If I told you that when you go to sleep at night, you don't just go to sleep, you die, and you're gone, and a new person wakes up in your bed the next morning, still has all your memories, still thinks they're you, goes through their life, and then they lay down and die in their turn. Is there any way that you could tell the difference from your life now? Can you prove to me that that's not exactly what happens? And the answer is no. The answer is no. There's no way that we can demonstrate that that is not exactly what will happen, that this one day is all we have in this world. And that question is obviously the existential dilemma of Mickey Barnes' life.
Yeah, and and I love that the way that you approach this in the book is not that you don't really tell the reader that this is what you should be feeling. You just leave all these little pieces and breadcrumbs where like little over little, you're just guiding us to like think about this. I think Lindsay mentioned this as we were kind of covering our story about the ship of the Theseus. Am I pronouncing that correctly?
Theseus, yeah.
Theseus, yeah, like it's just so fascinating, like all of the concepts that you kind of start bringing in and just kind of making the reader think about all of these philosophical questions and what it means to be ourselves. And I really enjoy that.
So
Do you feel like? Oh yeah,
I was
please.
just saying, touching on the ship of Theseus. That's an interesting topic. One of the early reviews implied that I had cribbed the idea of the ship of Theseus from WandaVision, which was a television show that came out in 2021, 3 years after I wrote the book. I do want to point out that who I actually cribbed that from was Plutarch, who came up with this idea 3,000 years ago, right? This is Ship of Theseus is not a new idea or one I made up or one that WandaVision made up either. It's something that's been floating around in the zeitgeist for a long time.
Do you feel like you've come to a conclusion about where you fall in that metaphor? Do you feel that the ship of Theseus is the original ship?
Uh, that's it. a really difficult question. When we look at sort of Mickey's life, do I think that um, that Mickey 6 and Mickey 5 and Mickey 4 are all the same people, which is basically right. That's the ship of Theseus all in one whack. That's instead of replacing yourself bit by bit, you get replaced over the long term. No, I don't think it's the same person. And interesting, this is a point that touches on my day job, on my regular medical research work. One of the things that I do in my research is work with a technique called functional magnetic resonance imaging, which is a technique we use to look at the human brain while it's doing things, and we can map what parts of the brain are doing what things. So we put you in the scanner, and then we ask you to think of the smell of cinnamon, and then we see what part of your brain lights up. There's an annual conference in Montreal every year dedicated just to this topic. It's called the Organization for Human Brain Mapping. Because as it turns out, everyone's brain is a little different in how it's structured and what parts do what. So really interesting research topic. One of the things that we find in this is that if we ask you in the scanner to think about something that you did yesterday, say, remember something you did yesterday, or imagine something you might do tomorrow, there's one particular part of your brain that lights up that does that work. If I were asked you, Magda, to think of something that Lindsay did yesterday, or imagine something Lindsay would do tomorrow, a completely different part of your brain is responsible for that work. Now, what happens if I ask you to remember something that you did when you were 5 years old? Which part of your brain do you suppose lights up at that point? It's the other person. It's the other person part. And the threshold is about 10 years. After about a 10-year gap, basically the responsibility for thinking about what happened to that person moves from the you part of the brain to the other person part of the brain, which interestingly corresponds roughly with the point where basically every cell in your body will have turned over and you are a completely new organism, right? There's not a living cell in your body that was part of your body when you were 5 years old. You are essentially, you've gone through what Mickey's gone through, just sort of one cell at a time. We really are the ship of Theseus. And on some level, our brains know that. Our brains think of it that way. And that is why things like anti-smoking campaigns, where they say, look, if you smoke when you're 20, you're going to die of cancer when you're 65, do nothing. They have no impact on people because on an emotional level, you know the 65-year-old you is not you. And you fundamentally don't care what happens to that person. Like intellectually, you may say, obviously, I want to take care of myself. But it doesn't hit you on an emotional level because on some level, your brain knows that's not your problem. And it doesn't worry about it.
It's interesting too, because I feel like you sort of, I mean, in the book, as a reader, unintentionally, I found myself rooting for Mickey 7 because he's the perspective that I'm in. And even though I get to see Mickey 8 and I'm told they are the same person with a 6-week gap, I think it sort of does a great job, that setup of making that argument in that way, because you're like, right, they are the same person, yet somehow I feel more connected to this other person whose perspective I'm closer to. Even though the other guy is still this same human that's having these same emotions, I'm just closer to the one that I'm reading about. It's done really well. Yeah.
But he's not exactly the same, and that was one of the hardest parts of writing this book, was writing the two voices in particular of the two Mickeys to be very similar but just subtly different. And I will say, I just saw the premiere of the movie in London last week. I was able to do the red carpet thing and all that business.
Congrats.
And Robert Pattinson takes that to a little further extreme. He does. He's playing both characters, obviously, and um, he really plays him in a way that you can tell just from seeing him on the screen or from hearing his voice, even though he's doing basically the same voice, which one he is at any given time. It's an impressive bit of acting. It really is.
That's impressive because, yeah, I think one of the main reasons why I felt like Mickey 8 was so different, I just found them to be a little bit, I don't want to say lazy, but he was just letting Mickey 7 do all the hard work as he was just hanging out. And he was just like, oh my gosh, like, why did this person, like, he's just manipulating Mickey 7, like, oh, I just came out of the slush, I'm too weak. Like, you have to go do the hard work. And I just immediately, I was just like, off put by that type of behavior, that in my head, it was just immediately a switch that I'm like, these are different people. And I don't feel like Mickey 7 would do that, but Mickey 8 does.
That was what I was going for. So again, I'm really glad you
Yeah.
picked up on that.
Oh, good. Speaking of all of the iterations of the Mickeys, you gave us like some really gory and kind of fun examples of how Mickey dies. Which one was your favorite death? I know that I did see one of your interviews where you addressed chapter 19, which is kind of when he dies of the amoeba in his brain, but we also see the Nasha relationship develop. So I wasn't sure if you wanted that because of the death of the relationship, but I just kind of want to talk about those two things.
Well, so there's two different answers to that question.
Hmm.
The one that's most important to the book is this quick sequence of three deaths that occur in chapter 19, because that's what cements the relationship between Mickey and Nasha. And in my mind, at least, and I think in Director Bong's as well, it's the relationship between Mickey and Nasha that is the heart of this book. That's, I write science fiction, but I don't write rockets and ray gun science fiction. I write science fiction that is about humans and human relationships and the way we interact. And the relationship between Mickey and Nasha is, at the end of the day, what this book is about. And that's the scene when Nasha forces her way into the isolation chamber and cradles him as he dies. That's where their bond is cemented. But my personal, because it is a particular horror of mine, is when he dies twice in a row of radiation poisoning. Radiation poisoning is the thing that has always freaked me out ever since I was a little kid. Again, in my medical research job, radiation exposure is one of the things that obviously plays a big role in oncogenesis. And so, it's something that I've had to think about a lot. We do a lot of work with radiation therapy, and there's a lot of radiation associated with the scanning that we do with CTs and PET scans. So we have to think about radiation safety. I actually do a lecture on radiation safety once a year for my company, where I talk about all the horrible things that can happen if you don't pay close attention to radiation safety. So that's something that hit me personally, and I don't know if that would have the same impact on other people as it did on me.
It totally did. I
Oh,
think, I
good.
mean, like, it totally did. Like, in just the way that you kind of do it, and he has to, like, well, we're gonna have to do this again. You're just like, oh my gosh, he's gonna have to do it twice in a row just to try to like research and try to like save the other people. It was really gut wrenching. But again, you use dark humor quite a bit in this book, so like it hits you, but you're just like, oh, but this is kind of portrayed in a lighthearted way, but it's getting you in your feels. So you just do a really beautiful job of balancing that out, and your horror of it didn't come through. It just kind of came through like this is like a terrible way of dying, but I'm telling you in a very light manner, which was a really great balance that you achieved.
I try to think of writing as analogous to cooking. Cooking is another thing that you might have gathered this from the book. Food is a big issue for me. Food is a big part of my life. It's something I think about a lot. And I consider myself a pretty good chef, and balancing out spices and flavors, sweetness with heat, with salt in a dish is really important. I think you have the same thing in writing. Um, you can't be relentlessly grim. You can't be relentless with horror. You can't be relentless with humor either. You need to have mixes of all of them, and humor provides a sort of a lightness that lets the horror go down a little easier, I think.
Agreed. All right. One last question that we kind of wanted to ask you. A lot of the names are derivative of Norse mythology. And I was just kind of wondering, like, what made you settle on that? Because there's so many options that you could kind of potentially gone with. And this is the one that it becomes a little bit more prominent in this book with like Niflheim, Melgard. Uh, what was your decision
Well,
process with that?
my family is Swedish. You wouldn't guess that from my last name. My paternal grandfather was an Englishman, but the rest of my family, and I think more of my heritage is Swedish, and Norse mythology is something that kind of got drilled into us when we were little. It sort of fed it to us with our lutefisk and our black-eyed peas and cream salmon. So that's something that was really fascinating to me when I was a kid. I've read a ton of Norse mythology, and I liked some of the ideas in Norse mythology and how it would apply to this. Niflheim obviously is the land of ice and snow, and it's one of the 9 worlds. It's the land of ice and snow, so pretty obvious why I would pick that as the name for that planet. Interestingly, one of my friends once asked ChatGPT to write a short story in the style of Edward Ashton, which was complete garbage, as you would probably expect. Pretty much any fiction coming out of ChatGPT is complete garbage. The one thing that it did pick up on, though, was it gave everybody Swedish names and it pulled a bunch of names. That was the one part of my writing, because it's not just in Mickey 7. This shows up repeatedly in my work and my short stories in particular. So it did grab onto that, but everything else was complete trash.
It's your digital legacy.
Yeah, that's it.
Swedish names.
That's it.
Oh my gosh, that's funny. And then one more thing, we know that you have a brand new book that's coming out. It's going to be released on February 25th called The Fourth Concert. Do you want to tell us a little bit about the story so all of our listeners learn about it?
Sure. So the Fourth Consort, I honestly feel this is my best work. It's a book that is really close to my heart. It plays with an idea that's pretty familiar in science fiction of there being a sort of a broader civilization out in the galaxy of like different species joining together for the good of everyone, and inviting humanity to join. And ask the question, well, what happens if we join and then we find out that what we've actually joined is a criminal gang? And there really is a broad civilization out there, and they hate us. They absolutely hate us. And that's the setup. The protagonist, Dawn Greaves, is also an interesting character type that you don't see so much in writing these days, but was really popular in the 70s and 80s, which I refer to as the sort of hyper competent broken man. He's someone he's really accomplished. He's a former soldier. He's highly educated, but he has a tragedy in his life that completely ruined his life, threw his life completely off the rails, and signing on with this, sort of supposedly benevolent galactic organization, which actually is not benevolent at all, was a way for him to sort of try to reset his life. And he realizes 3 years on that he's made a mistake. But at that point, you're however many light years from Earth, and he doesn't really have a way to make good on it. So that's a setup, and it goes from there. It's got the first time I've had explicit comic relief characters in a book. Instead of just having snark distributed widely across characters, I really concentrated in a couple of them, which I thought worked out really well. I've gotten a lot of good feedback on those two in particular from the early reviews of the book. And it's similar to this. It's got some philosophical themes in it. It's got some depth to it, but it's got a lot of humor as well, and a lot of fun creatures. It also includes a giant sentient snail, and I'm like, how can you go wrong with that? Right? How can you go wrong with a big snail?
You do a really good job with all of the creatures that you kind of come up in this world, like in
Well, thank
space
you.
worlds. I really love them. And, not to kind of take it back to Mickey 7, but the creepers who are like half metal and then they have made like, you are really creative. Like, it's not always, like in a lot of sci-fi fictions with like the creatures, they're always like these monsters, bipeds and things like that. And you're actually thinking like, it doesn't have to just be a biped. It could just be something else. So I'm
I mean,
excited
it
to see
almost
it.
certainly wouldn't be, right? The
Exactly.
idea that
Right.
something coming from a completely different evolutionary tree than us. I mean, even if you look at the things that popped up in the Cambrian explosion 540 million years ago, all the different body plans that popped up, like the weird worm that had legs sticking out in every direction that looked like a pincushion. The fact that the sort of quadrupedal or bipedal body plane was the one that won out, that didn't have to happen. Right?
Yeah.
We could all be descended from hallucinogenia right now, not from whatever sort of quadrupedal fish we actually descended from. That was just random happening, and there's no reason to think that would have happened on some other planets. Completely new evolutionary tree. Anything really should be on the table at that point.
100%. Well, thank you so much. This is, so just to kind of reiterate, it's fourth concert and it comes out on Tuesday, February 25th. Probably when the episode comes out, it's already going to be out. So go check it out.
I would like to make one more point if I could.
Yeah, of course.
Just because I've gotten a little bit of grief about this from some of the early reviewers. I did say in the jacket cover that I mentioned the term bizarre love triangle. Some people have taken that to mean that they expect things to get spicy with the aliens. That does not happen. There is nobody's getting freaky in this book. So if that's what you're looking for, you probably need to go somewhere else. I thought it was an interesting way to describe one of the relationships among the characters. Apparently, that might have been a mistake. Some people are going in there to look for something spicy. Came away disappointed. So I just want to put that out there.
I saw that on your website. I appreciated it, but honestly, you're not going to be disappointed. And in theory, you could read Mickey7 for that. And
Things get a little freakier in Mickey7. Yeah, there are bits and pieces there for sure.
Well, Edward, thank you so much for taking the time to chat with us today about your book and your work. We really appreciate it. Do you want to tell the listeners where they can find you online?
Yeah, you can find all my work, links to all my work, my books, everything else at edwardashton.com. I'm also on all the social media things at Ed Ashton Writing.
Excellent. Thank you so much for your time.
Yep, thank you. Really appreciate the opportunity.
Thank you for listening to Literally Books, the podcast,
where we say what we read
and we mean what we say. Bye.